Good afternoon. How are y'all doing today? Say again? Excellent. I'm doing wonderful. I'm Ron Reed with South by Southwest EDU, and it's a treat to introduce the next featured session, both to the room and to our online community. As you've heard before in many sessions, you can use Slido, the mobile app, to ask questions, and you do that by clicking the Engage button on the session listing or in the online schedule. At South by Southwest EDU, we know that education has the power to transform and empower. We believe education is a passport to opportunity and a brighter tomorrow and a more humane world. One of the great travesties of our time is that educational opportunity is inequitably and inconsistently offered. Our next speakers will bring some profound insights to disrupting that truth. I'm so excited we'll be joined today by Dr. Tequilla Brownie. Dr. Brownie is the first ever Black leader of TNTP, the New Teacher Project, TNTP, which is a nationally recognized nonprofit working with schools all across the nation to disrupt racial inequity so that all kids, especially young Black and brown students, can succeed. I'm also tickled to introduce my friend, Dr. Kevin Michael Foster, who will help moderate today's conversation. Kevin brings three powerful perspectives to the conversation. First, he is chair of Black Studies at the University of Texas, my alma mater, right down the street. He also is a trustee of the Austin Public School System, the Austin ISD, and I'm so proud for him to contribute his service in that capacity. And finally, Kevin brings perspective as the founder and executive producer of the popular Black Academics program on PBS. I think we're all in for a treat. Please give them both a warm welcome as we bring Tequilla and Kevin to the stage.
Thanks, buddy. So good afternoon, folks. I try to do something I did do with my students, which is I close down the back rows and invite everyone forward. But there was resistance as there's so many panels and so many things going on. But we have this audience here, and then we have, of course, a virtual audience for our conversation today. And our conversation is with Dr. Tequilla Brownie. We can go through all the accolades and all the warm-up and all the things to talk about Dr. Brownie and her work, but I think one of the best ways we can do it is through a short video clip.
I grew up in the Mississippi Delta in rural Arkansas in a small town. When I got to college, there were more people in my freshman class than were in my entire hometown. The house we lived in sat right back there, didn't have indoor plumbing, was very cold, so cold in the winter, the bucket of water would freeze up and you had to break it to get a drink of water. Fortunately though, my grandparents valued family, they valued education, and they knew that that would be our way out. Had a great school experience. My kindergarten teacher looked like me. My high school principal looked like me. The research is clear and shows that when students have access to educators that look like them, they're more likely to go to college, to graduate from college. So when I got to high school, my guidance counselor looked at my standardized test scores and thought, we should really support you and help you get to an Ivy League college. I loved Yale. I had a great experience there. When I first got there, my first semester, I was hesitant to make a lot of friends, hesitant to really, dive into the campus culture because I was afraid, what if I can't make it? But what I found when I got there was that my professors and my advisors, they wanted me to be successful. So I found myself in a place again where the adults around me saw hope for me and saw a future for me and supported me in reaching my goals.
Tequilla Andrea Banks, Doctor of Education.
I always cared about interrupting generational poverty. I realized, and the way you do that is through education. I don't view education as the end. Education is a means to an end to help kids like myself escape generational poverty and have access to opportunities in life that set them up for success to have economic mobility and social mobility. TNTP is a national nonprofit that works in education. And our whole focus and mission is to make sure that we're interrupting the educational inequities that are happening for far too many children.
The focus for decades has been about how do we transform systems, because we have not done so well for Black students, for Latinx students, right, for other students of color. And what we have missed is the real understanding of what these communities are going through, of what it's like to be from the community that you're trying to impact. And to have someone like Tequilla with all her experience, her amazing ability to just bring people along, I just think is fascinating. I'm very proud of TNTP for this move.
The ability to impact that magical moment when a teacher gets in front of a student, that is what our work is about. How we'll know we're successful, kids will finish our K-12 programs, they'll go on to college, they'll go on to their careers to make choices about what directions they want their lives to go. Education is what helps students shift the very trajectory of their lives. And so if we're able to recreate those magical moments on a consistent basis and for all children, we're talking about changing generations, changing the lives of generations of Americans.
So Tequilla, we had an opportunity to chat a couple of times before this afternoon, and I love the idea of the video sort of teeing up our conversation because it highlights not only your sort of academic accolades and where you are now, but the journey from here to there. So just as a starting point for our conversation, I want to ask you, are our schools, in the sense they worked for you, are our schools working today?
I mean, it's a great question, Kevin, and I would say the answer is in the data. When we look at the data, we know that the racial wealth gap is growing. It's pervasive, particularly for, obviously, Black and brown students. And so if we think about the intent of an education, which is to be that great equalizer for all students, my answer would be no, it's not working, and we have to acknowledge that, and we've got to rethink the entire systems in order to make that be true.
So when we talk about this, so I'm struck by the difference again, but your experience, so it worked for you, right? Is that part of your understanding today? Is it informed by both? What informs your perspective today?
Yeah, totally. So my perspective at this point is informed, yes, absolutely, by my lived experience. It's also informed by the experience of other students from my community who, for them, my story is not their story. My story is the exception. And it's also informed by my professional experience. I started out as a school social worker. I've worked in research and policy and education, for about 20 years. And I had a really interesting and epiphany early in my career after welfare reform. I was working in, the aspect of helping former welfare recipients, get off and stay off welfare. And I realized that, the way that you do that is by helping people never get on welfare to begin with. And education. I mean, that's where I landed from a professional perspective, and because of my lived experience, along with my professional experience, I feel like I have a clear sense of what's actually needed at this point in order to help education actually become that great equalizer.
All right, so that obviously tees us up towards, well, then what is there a collective goal, or what is the collective goal that we should have and embrace?
You know, Kevin, it's interesting. I'll get nerdy for just a moment. But if you look at the purpose of education and the history of education in our country, education has always been connected to what our broader society needs. One of my favorite authors on the topic, Dr. Patricia Albert Graham from Harvard, talks about the aims of education. And so if you look back during the 1900s, right, education was the vehicle by which our country helped, immigrants assimilate and, into the country. Then during the 20s, during the Industrial Revolution, education again served as the vehicle to help, farming families migrate to the cities to work in the factories. During the Civil Rights era, education served as the vehicle for access to minority and people of color. And then, most recently, education has been, as we were looking out globally and we saw that, wow, are we really competing with our global competitors, China, Japan, et cetera? We saw our country beginning to lag, and so we focused on achievement. Well, if you follow that history, the question becomes, okay, at this point, what is actually needed? And my premise is that because we know that education has always served the needs of our country, we focused almost obsessively with this notion of readiness, college and career readiness. And it's pretty abstract, and it pretends that there's one path, and it actually sets the bar and the destination as readiness, when in fact our promise and our commitment is that education is the equalizer. That means that for impact, we've got to make sure that it's actually doing that, helping kids from poverty, like myself, actually be on a pathway to economic and social mobility.
So the historical lens that you would bring from some really strong scholars and theorists and historians is that the system, our systems, have served a greater good, but is it then sometimes at the expense of the success of the individual, or do they always work in lockstep?
You know what's interesting? So one of my beliefs at this point is around connecting students very early with a focus on career learning and readiness that's going to get them to economic and social mobility. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying like let's get rid of electives or anything like that, but it's about let's understand what kids' passions and interests are and what their aspirations are and help them on that path. In TNTP, our research has shown us, we published a report in 2018 called The Opportunity Myth. Kids were very clear about what their aspirations were. The system is actually failing, though, at setting them up to be successful on those paths. To more succinctly answer your question, though, I think back to the era when we did, track, right? We used to track kids into black and brown kids into vocational courses because we had low expectations for them. And so the notion of CTE was associated with, oh, that's for them, right? That we have low expectations. So we overcompensated, I believe, as a country. And in our efforts to overcompensate for that, we said, oh, no, we're not going to track, which we shouldn't, let's be clear. But we said, oh, everybody's going to be on this one path, and it's college and career readiness. And so then what happened is that we thought, let me be clear, systems, this, systems and policies don't change human behavior. And so we'd made this big policy shift and this system shift where we thought that, okay, now we get rid of tracking, we put kids in this college career readiness track, and that it all is well, right? Well, the opposite is true. Our research has shown us that the thing that was undergirding that was bias and low expectations and in some cases racism. That is still true today. Our research again has shown us low expectations is pervasive in our schools today, and it affects black and brown students and kids from poverty more so than any other population.
Could you go back to the piece about, you were talking about the difference between listening to students and their sense of the opportunities, and you were saying that wasn't mapping to what our systems are providing. Is that going to the question of bias, or is that about something else?
I think it's actually about both. So we assume that kids and their families can and don't have agency, And they actually do. They have a vested interest. I think part of the problem is, so I was a psych major undergrad. I love motivational theories. One of my favorites is expectancy theory, which helps you understand what motivates a person. They have to understand the reward, be motivated by it, and connect their effort to that actual reward. And so in our schools today, too few of our kids from poverty, actually it's not because they don't value an education, but again, if that's the destination, you're asking them to value education for education's sake. Now, flip that a little bit and think about if kids actually saw education not as the destination, but as a means to an end, then you're talking about a different motivational construct for them, right? Now they're saying, oh, this connects to my ability to have economic and social mobility. For me, people ask me, they ask me when they find out about my background and how I grew up in my childhood, and first when they hear, they're like, you grew up in a house without indoor plumbing, really? I'm like, yes. And then they ask a few more questions, and they find out that I chopped cotton as a child. And they're like, oh, wow, Tequilla, you don't look 100. Are you 100? And I'm like, no, I'm not 100. But that was poverty. That was my lived experience. And so then their next question is, oh my God, how did you get from an outhouse to Yale? If I'm being facetious, I'll say by plane. But then to get to their question, I'm very clear that what motivated me, they're waiting for some lofty, idealistic framework for me to say, oh, I loved learning or I loved Shakespeare. No, I wanted to have a better life. I wanted a bathroom. And I mean, as like, silly, right, or of an example as that sounds, that truly was my motivation to escape poverty. Fast forward to the present, we have too many kids that are, millions of kids actually, that are delivered right back into the hands of poverty that they were born into.
So, yes, yes, and yes, and amen, on the assessment.
Yeah.
And then, I think we get to bend towards like kind of where we can go. But I'm struck by, and we didn't talk about this, but it's completely consistent with what you're talking about. There was an anthropologist, Jean Anyon, who talked about social reproduction in education. And her assessment after doing field work and looking at a variety of different schools, and this was the wealthier one, this was the working class, this one was here, this one was there, what she saw was that each school operated slightly differently. The basic curricular frame might be the same, but this one went a little bit more that way, this one went a little bit more that way. The teachers had different expectations and literally different ways of operating. Do I punish a kid and get really upset if he blurts out in excitement? Or do I say, that was wonderful, tell me more? So I guess you would co-sign and you see the social reproduction in education. And that's part of what you want to break up.
Absolutely, Kevin. There's a saying that wealth begets wealth. Well, the inverse is also true. Poverty begets poverty. Children from poverty are almost guaranteed to enroll in historically low-performing schools. And all of the baggage that comes with that, they're exposed to. And so the system designed, or we say, to be that great equalizer, actually perpetuates that cycle. The kids go to these underperforming schools. To your point, they don't get the experiences that wealthier and more affluent families actually get. They are trapped in that system after spending the first 18 years of their lives in our schools. We turn them right back into the conditions in which they were born.
So one of the things that caught my eye and my ear when I was watching the video was you made the comment that you had teachers that looked like you.
Yes.
And we can talk about racial affinity and that sort of thing, but I think there's something else there, or something that is a symptom of, or something that correlates with that, around the idea of the teacher's belief in you.
Yeah.
So what were the circumstances that had you receive that type of teaching? Because there we are talking about our education system working for a moment.
Yeah, so I think a couple things I would say. One is that to be clear, the research shows all students actually benefit from having more diverse teachers. So it's not an either or, it's actually a win-win. Now, for Black and brown students, they actually achieve even greater when they have access to teachers that look like them. That was for me, that was my lived experience. My kindergarten teacher literally looked like me. My principal did. And what it is, to your point, it's not just like an affinity of, oh, I identify with this person. In our research, we actually have found that when the teacher actually shares the same race of the student, they have higher expectations for them. And then those higher expectations translate into greater outcomes for students. So it actually it starts there with the expectations, but it translates to then what they do in practice and the choices that they make to give some students an opportunity and some students not. In my own experience, it was those teachers that made sure, yes, and even to your point about different schools, well, even different schools, even different classrooms, right? It boils down, right now it's a gamble for a student to get in a good school and with a good teacher, right? And so we need to understand more, what are good schools doing that are helping kids experience academic mobility, and what are teachers doing within those classrooms to make sure that kids have high expectations and are having the type of experience that is going to set them up for economic and social mobility.
And I like the idea of the both and. So the acknowledgement that for this little Black boy, having a Black male teacher might be huge in his life. For this student coming from a specific region of Guatemala, finding that there are other folks in the area, in the education pipeline, and seeing that connection can be very meaningful. And having a diversity of teachers as part of your K-12 experience, so that you have teachers from here, teachers from there, teachers from this background. It seems like we can do a both and without ruffling too many feathers, or maybe it does ruffle feathers.
Maybe it ruffles feathers, but I would say forget what side of the page you're on from a political standpoint. As a social worker, I'll say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and getting different results, and getting the same results over and over. If you look at the data and you track it, Kevin, when I track the data, you look at the number of Black kids who, first of all, graduate from high school, roughly 80%, depending on which year. And then out of that number, you look at the number that then go on to college and then graduate from college. You're talking out of every 100 students, 9. 9 students out of every 100 are actually graduated from college and on that path. Assuming that college is the one path for economic and social mobility, do you know what happens to the other 91? They go right back into the conditions that they were born into. So again, my response to that is, look at the data. Are we satisfied really with a return on investment of our public education system that delivers 91 out of 100 right back into poverty? I'm not.
So many of our schools, and boy, I'm tempted. We promised that I wouldn't go into governance, I wouldn't go into school board land, et cetera. So I'm gonna do my best to steer us clear and to stay in your wheelhouse, which is the research-backed programs that can have the impact. One of the things that we wrestle with are the range of programs in our schools. And in some scenarios and in many municipalities, this side of town has this curriculum and this framework and these pathways. And this side has these pathways. And interestingly, one of the quiet secrets is that you will have kids going from the affluent side of town coming over because they really like ag, or they really like some of the certification opportunities in the other side of town. So do you have a perspective on the sort of range of programmatic opportunities we should have?
Yeah, so both from my own lived experience and my, sort of professional journey in our work at TNTP, we know that there is no one silver bullet. And I think we have to acknowledge in education and in ed reform that we've chased these proverbial silver bullets, and there is not one. There are multiple things that have to be true if we're going to shift that 91 out of 100 black kids going right back into poverty. For me, and in the research, yes, kids need absolutely the foundational skills, the 3 R's, if you will, the academic foundational skills. But I think there's something, if we look in our context and look towards the future and understand work in the future, yes, there will always be, specialized roles that require, deeper knowledge and deeper expertise, but there are some skills and experiences that the future tells us all kids will need. We know the economy is driven by technology, by climate change, and by the ability to innovate. And so if you think about the skills that kids will actually need in order for that to be true for them, to be able to adapt, to work in a digital environment, let's make sure all students have access to those type of experiences versus those being optional. To your point about sort of schools within different pockets of a community, what I've learned is that, sure, we say we're consistently trying to make sure that all kids have the foundational academic skills. For me, it wasn't just my academic skills in isolation that helped me be successful. I had access to people that, exposed me to social capital, for example. I had adults that advise me. You're in higher education, so you're well aware of this notion of intrusive advising, right? Why aren't we doing that in K-12? Right? I mean, our guidance counselors, we use them to test students, right? Instead of helping them focus or whatever role, but focusing on narrowing into a student, understanding what drives them, what are their passions, how do we help connect that to a longer aspiration of their career pathway that's going to set them up for economic mobility. And so it's those things like that we treat as, we consider them enrichment or optional. But if you look in affluent communities, those kids are getting those types of experiences, right? They're having seminal experiences. They're getting advising in that way. They're getting access to social capital. Poor kids aren't getting that type of thing. And what I would argue is that should not and cannot continue to be optional for our kids. That has to be a core construct of their K-12 experience as well.
One of the things, so my superintendent, we were at the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators, and she just told a story of, I think, living in the Valley, and her mother's ideology, her mother's philosophy, cleaning houses, was watching what those folk do with their kids and saying, one way, by hook or by crook, I'm going to do that. So that's how she got into, flamenco, but also ballet and these other enrichment activities. But that takes a special, sometimes, commitment if you don't have the material resources, or you don't even have a sense of the connectedness, because it's not in your wheelhouse, it's not in your sets of experiences. So are you talking about these sorts of things that are often co-curricular or extracurricular being part of the way we think about schooling?
Absolutely. So what's interesting about my experience, I grew up in rural Arkansas, and during the time of my childhood, former President Clinton was actually my governor for most of my childhood. And one of the things that was present in Arkansas during those years was the recognition that Arkansas was made up of a lot of rural communities that didn't have the resources themselves to extend those types of experiences to kids like me. So we had a lot of initiatives and programming and things like that that were priorities and driven straight from the governor's office, but then given access to students and kids from all over the state. So a lot of the seminal experiences that I had growing up, my direct community wasn't able to provide it, but the broader focus from, elected officials and the broader community, yes, in K-12, but even outside of K-12, were actually the things that were present for me. My first job, leadership experience, I worked at Governor's Youth Camp, right? That was, funded and set up by the governor, but it was an experience for all students to focus on, academic and social skills, but also leadership, right? And things like that, that again, helped me to be successful in life.
So you're to blame, not me, when we did veer into policy. So what you seem to be hinting at, well, not hinting at, saying policy matters, the framework and the ideology of our leaders, our elected officials matters, but then it gets their framework and funding sets conditions of possibility. But those conditions of possibility then have to be lived into with good practice and good programming. Is that part of where TNTP comes in?
It is. So one of the things about TNTP, I mean, we're a 25-year-old organization now, and we have done, work all over the country. We have about 800 staff today that are working all over the country and in our territories. We've learned a lot over the course of our 25 years, and what I would say is that we've learned there is no silver bullet, top-down change, so only change driven by, think tanks or elected officials, that's not going to be sustainable. And then grassroots, bottoms-up change often doesn't scale. So you've got to bring those two together. I'm not afraid to talk about the politics. I think we use politics as a distraction to what should be our destination, which is the education system living into the American dream and being the great equalizer. That has to be, number one, our first, commitment and focus. But those things have to come together. So our policies and our practices, to your point, they've got to align, but we've got to be clear on the destination. To date, our destination right now is this readiness. And I'm saying we've got to set a different destination. Our destination has to be economic and social mobility for kids. Because then that's when we'll start to realize that, that 91 kids that were failing, I would hope we will look ourselves in the mirror and acknowledge that we have a lot more work to do. We can pat ourselves on the back all day that 5 more black boys are not on the pipeline to prison because their reading scores went up. That's great, but my question is that your North Star for your own child to no longer be on, the pipeline to prison? That's not. I have a 12-year-old, and if someone were to tell me, Tequilla, Markel he's on grade level, in reading. He's not on the pipeline to prison pathway. Really? That's how I would look at them, and so I would ask the same of every black and brown, every white, every affluent, every poor parent. Is that your goal for your own child? And I hope the answer is no.
And by the way, what we see from the data we can gather from kids, from families, and what we know even in the municipality in which I am a trustee, is that parents and families are doing everything they can to move the needle for their kids. Even, for instance, you mentioned lower performing schools and higher performing schools. What we've seen among in our schools is that everybody's trading up. So the kids in the lowest performing schools are disproportionately trying to get out of those lower performing schools and transferring to another, and up the line, folks are exercising, what do you want, a choice or whatever, to move around. So we have ample data that what folks want is things to be better for their kids and themselves. We also have this long-standing myth, I'm sorry to call it a myth, But education as the great equalizer, when from what you're saying, what I've seen in data, what I've experienced, is that education right now is the great stabilizer. Where you start is where you finish. So that, it sounds like, is what we need to disrupt. There should be no predictability around where you will end up based upon where you started out.
Totally agree, Kevin. I would say that's why, the work of a lot of researchers and others in the field focused on, understanding the predictability, to your point, of race, zip code, and those things is really helpful in illuminating. And what I say now, we've got to go that next step and figure out now what needs to be true so that where you start is not where you finish, right? And so that is absolutely critical, because this intergenerational cycle of wealth begetting wealth and poverty begetting poverty is exactly where we are today. And it's a great time to do that. I mean, we can look at the context of our country now. Other industries, right, are grappling with how to make sure they have a workforce. Well, guess what? If we don't get education right, no one will have the talent or have a workforce. It's a really critical time in our country. We're in this great reshuffle, right? Everyone is focused on this and thinking of this. K-12 should not be working in isolation to solve for this. We all have a vested interest. Our nation's very fiber, values, and economy matter to us having a viable workforce. And guess what? Black and brown kids and kids from poverty are an essential part of that workforce. Upward. Do you know in the data that when you look at the average salaries in our country, median salary, is about $42,000. That's, I know it, fluctuates by geographical area. But did you know that almost 43% of Black Americans work for under $30,000? They're working for poverty wages. They're working for poverty. Like, hear that, I work for poverty. That is unacceptable, and we have to go back. It can't be after we fail them and there are, we introduce an initiative, right, for opportunity youth or to reskill adults. Why would we invest there? Let's invest on the front end in K-12, helping all of us be focused on connecting kids and making sure that they are on a path to economic and social mobility. Let's invest before they fail, so that we don't not only fail them, we don't fail our country.
And the bottom line is millions and millions and millions of us believe in education as the pathway. So we should operationalize that, right?
We absolutely do. And I think one of the problems, and we talked about this in some of our research in the opportunity myth. What's interesting, Kevin, when you say that in practice, and everyone says, oh, of course I believe in education, right? And of course this. But do we realize that every single adult in the chain of what happens to a student, they make decisions daily on behalf of students. And either your low expectations for students are driving those choices that you make on behalf of students, or your high expectations are driving that. So we can't ignore the underlying thing here to make sure that all students are having access to adults that have high expectations for them, that are helping to connect their passions and interests to a career that's going to help them leave the conditions they were born into and get to a path for economic and social mobility.
So we have about 20 minutes left. So I want to throw one more question to you and then go to our live and virtual audience and hear questions from them and lift those up. What is the role of partnerships, philanthropics, et cetera?
So you heard me say that there is no one silver bullet, right? The same way that there is no one silver bullet, There is no one organization alone that's going to be able to do this. I'm clear about that. I believe, and TNTP is absolutely the right organization for me to have my impact in the world and for the 800 staff members that are committed to this work, but we cannot do it alone. For example, we know at TNTP we've been in conversations with the Christensen Institute. They've done a phenomenal amount of work and research and practice around social capital and figuring out how do we infuse social capital, into K-12. So that means at TNTP is we're trying to lean into that. Not that that's the one silver bullet, but we're clear that that is something that matters. We don't have to start from zero. We should be partnering with other experts that are already thinking about that. And then when you pull the things together, that's when we can get more synergy. There's, as you know, a sort of perverse incentive where, you get funding, and so you find the one silver bullet, you prove to your funder, yay, we did it. And at the end of the day, Johnny still can't read, and Johnny is going right back into the poverty he was born into. And so that system, that whole framework, we cannot, right? The urgency, I can't stress enough, we can't continue to do that because that's what's delivering the results that we're getting. Only 9 out of every black kids out of 100 on a pathway to economic and social mobility. 9.
Right. So this is a cool system, like they're upvoted, and so folks are sending in questions. The questions are getting cosigns from peers around the nation, and I get to look at it on a monitor and try to not let you all know I'm blind as a bat. So how do we address the roots of racial inequity in public education, namely the under-resourcing of schools and de facto segregation through quote-unquote school choice?
It's interesting when I talk to people about school choice and, sort of what that means. My first conversation with them is that we're actually focused on the wrong thing. And by that I mean, we can look at history and see examples where we made policy decisions or governance decisions, and that drove the conversation. So for me, when I think about school choice, I think we're focused on the wrong thing. Again, that's a destination. Is a kid landing in a school that has a good reputation? Right? That's really the wrong thing. When in fact we should be focused on, at scale, are students actually on the right trajectory? And whether or not, if you look at the data, we did this when I worked in Memphis, the schools that were sort of high regarded, sure, there were effective teachers in those schools, but guess what? There were ineffective ones as well. So just getting into that school, it's not, drop the mic, party over. You've got to then make sure that the student is then getting with a teacher that is actually an effective teacher. So again, we pick these battles, these sort of isolated battles, and lose the focus on, at scale, is this working for students? Now, let me be clear. We have a big problem in how we fund schools. And so when I think about what kids need, sure, we have to tackle the inequities that are pervasive and the under-resourcing, but again, we have to source the right thing, which means a clear destination, not this arbitrary readiness, and then making sure that kids are getting both the academic skills that they need, as well as what now we think of as these optional and enrichment skills that affluent kids are actually getting through their experience.
So another question that comes up is, how do you challenge a school's leadership to have honest discussions on inequity in their school when they believe they are doing good work?
You look at the outcomes. And so to do that, one of the things that we do at TNTP, we do these opportunity scorecards. And what's interesting is data don't lie, right? Like, I'm a social worker, I'm also a researcher, right? So I kind of have both of those, I bring both of those lenses to the table. And we've even worked with superintendents in their communities to share, here's your reality. Now, we walk them through the process, talk about, leading a horse to water, or whatever, however you say that, but there's this notion of the data looking you in the face. So again, I'm not lamenting school leaders who think they're doing good work. At TNTP, I've been in education for, a couple of decades, right? Not 100, remember, even though I chop cotton, but I've been at this a while myself, and so I too think I've done good work. And yet look at what's happening in the data. So it's not enough for any of us to pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we're doing good work, when 91 out of 100 kids are going right back into their conditions.
I love that answer. I love that question, and I love the answer, and you can go layers deep. So let's say we have school A and school B, and they're demographically different, and somebody says, well, this is the best we can do given these kids, or given this neighborhood. But what data allows us to do is go to another school with the same profile and different results. And so what data tells us is all kids can achieve, and that it's our responsibility, then we can choose the responsibility that you invite us to live into, is to have them achieve.
Exactly.
I love that. So DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, tend to be seen as a zero-sum game. How do we do a better job of helping families understand that more equitable schools are good for everyone?
I think for that one, I would go back to what I said earlier about the destination. Mm-hmm. So when we keep talking about about education as the destination, that's when we get woven into the politics associated with this zero-sum, aspect. When Black and brown kids do better, we all will do better. Again, I go back to connecting education historically, as I said, has always had this intersection with our broader national need and national economy. Mm-hmm. Now, we all know when the economy is doing great, we all have the opportunity to do better and to do great. So it's not about the DEI policies as like, oh, let's adopt DEI policies, end result. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, lots of researchers and educators have, run through and done the research around showing that equity policies actually help organizations perform better. There's a business case for DEI and for that. That's no different from school. Having those policies, there's a business case for better performance for the organizations, let alone the ability, the impact for those students.
I'd even say there's a student quality of life case. One of the things you said early on in some of our conversations about listening to students. And what I notice about our students is so many are so in love with the diversity of possibility. My classrooms at UT are not full of any one, this, that, or the other. And that is actually what the students prefer.
Yes.
So maybe if we listen to them, some of the DEI stuff kind of takes care of itself if we get out of the way. So we set the policy and the frameworks and we let the kids live into it.
It's interesting, and apply that to in a different context, but similarly, when I talk to people about this focus on career-connected learning for students, and yes, starting at kindergarten, I'm like, oh, Tequilla. People say, oh, Tequilla, kindergartners, we're going to talk to them about careers. And I'm like, have you been in a kindergarten lately? And when you ask kindergartners, oh, what do you want to be? What do? They say, oh, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a policeman. They talk about careers that they've been exposed to. So don't tell me that it's insane to think that we can expose kindergartners, to your point, to other opportunities. Unfortunately, because of their conditions, maybe they haven't been exposed to that. Their parents may lack the social capital to make sure they are exposed to a coder or an engineer, so they don't even know to dream, to your point, and think about all of the options that are out there. And I'm saying let's do that with intentionality, even from kindergarten, to your point, so that the kids can grapple with that, figure out what their passion is and go forward on that path.
Nice. So how can we integrate innovative initiatives outside traditional school that are attempting to transform education to disrupt the traditional system? How can we integrate innovative initiatives outside traditional school that are attempting to transform education to disrupt the traditional system?
You know, so there's one thing that I would say we learned during the course of the pandemic. And as we've seen families choose different options, you know who we saw step up to the plate? A lot of community-based organizations, right? We saw families send their kids to community-based organizations and make sure that their kids were getting access, even though schools were shut down, getting access to the types of things that they did. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned still to be told and still unfolding about how we can think about some of those innovations that were introduced during COVID that were required, that we need to bring forward with us as tools and levers to disrupt the traditional system. Again, K-12, I think in systems theory, right, as a social worker. So K-12 is only one aspect of the broader ecosystem of systems focused on trying to disrupt poverty. I mean, we know about the social determinants of health. I mean, of health, right? There's healthcare, there's housing, right? All of us trying really hard to get at the things that all contribute to poverty. K-12, we should not do it alone. And in some ways, we have tried to, in our own isolated circle, like go at it really hard and really fast and with urgency and getting the same results. We cannot continue to do that. We've got to partner with other sectors, with other organizations for the broader good. And I'm clear that now is the time, and I'm ready, and TNTP is ready to lead this charge.
Yeah, one of the, I have this conversation with folks all the time. One of the unacknowledged realities is that our schools, because we're accountable to an academic outcome, we take it seriously, and we say, well, what do we need? And then we say, well, you know what? These kids with toothaches and no caps and are not doing well. These kids with housing insecurity aren't doing well. These kids that can't see aren't doing well. These kids with food insecurity aren't doing well. And so we brought more and more of that in the schools because we're smart enough to know a hungry child is not in a great position to learn. But as that's happened, it's almost been unacknowledged by the larger society that the school, like we always say, the school is the centerpiece of this community. It's really the centerpiece of the community because it's the lifeblood of the community. We have examples. There was a fire in an apartment complex next to one of my schools, and we have a lot of refugee resettlement. So we had kids speaking a number of languages, families speaking a number of languages. When EMT came, fire, and everybody came, the first thing that the families did was actually call our school because we had the translators. Yeah. So we're doing so much because we have to. Right. Because it's the only way to get it done. Well, it's not the only way to get it done. It's the only way to get it done in our current context. Mm-hmm. So it seems like, how do we reimagine possibility around partnerships so that what we do as educators is provide the education and not have to do all of the other things that are the preconditions for education?
I mean, I think the thing you're raising, this notion of partnering in the right way, is exactly the right one. I mean, I'm excited today to announce, and we've shared with folks, that TNTP was awarded a $20 million grant from McKinsey Scott. A testament to I take it as a testament to the strength of the organization, the commitment of the organization, but more importantly, the urgency of the moment. Mm-hmm. Again, as I think about us leading this charge toward reimagining a future for students where education is that great equalizer, and we stop delivering those 91 children back to poverty, Gifts like Mackenzie Scott's help us at TNTP to accelerate with urgency and figure out the innovations and the priorities, and to your point, the things in the partnership to actually help make that become a reality. So I'm really excited at TNTP for us to leverage that gift along with all of our other partners in the work and our other funders in the work to really maximize this moment to make that dream a reality for kids.
And part of what I see and like and appreciate with the 25-year history is the range of expertise. And you've said it a couple times, and I think it's worth having it be part of our understanding. It's not a single thing. There's not one piece of the puzzle. There's so many pieces that have to work in concert, which means complexity.
Yes.
But hopefully we are at a time in our lives, well, we did it with hybrid learning, right? We found a way over the last year to deliver instruction. It wasn't perfect, but we found a way to continue to deliver instruction in conditions that none of us were prepared for. Now, we do a little online instruction at UT Austin, and it's like this. And now we had to go to scale and repurpose everything, and we pulled it off. So I'm hopeful and excited and congratulatory of a $20 million infusion of possibility. We have time for, I guess, a couple more questions, and I want to pause to say, by the way, this type of work is what I do for a living, trying to facilitate possibility through conversation. And some folks are like awesome, amazing, immediate partners. These questions that are coming in are like grad level, sophisticated questions that we could unpack for a time. And you say, oh, well, yes, and you're right on it. So I'm super, and I'm not surprised at all, but I just want to, I guess, as we're coming towards our end, be congratulatory of you, celebratory of you, laud you, and just I'm enjoying this intellectual partnership. And, hopefully with South by Southwest EDU, this is going to extend to many of the sessions. So some closing questions. What advice would you give educators wanting to make impactful, sustainable changes for equity in their districts?
I think the first thing I would ask them is to understand, number one, what's your current destination? And if your current destination is readiness and you can't prove through data that your students are on track for economic and social mobility, then you have the wrong destination. And once you figure that out, figure out where the inequities lie. And on both parallels there, understanding, are your kids on track academically, and are your kids on track socially and from that enrichment perspective to make sure that they're going to have the type of outcomes and experiences that they need. And make sure that the third thing I would say, make sure that that's true for all kids. Because what happens, we'll look at the data and it's buried in what that means. We've gotten a little bit better, right, about like disaggregating by race. I would say go that next step deeper. Not only just look by race, by school, by zip code, by neighborhood. Understand the context of all of your students and the nuance within that, and make sure your initiatives and your efforts are aligned to addressing that point.
It is brave for teachers, for schools, for districts to look at their data, but it is the only way. You have to embrace your data, especially when it tells you things you don't want to hear, because now you know what you need to do.
Yeah, but we can't measure for measurement's sake.
Amen.
Right? And the point I would say, no, I am pro accountability. Let me be very clear. But right now, I feel like what we do, we measure, but then we do the same thing all over. We don't change anything. And so that's where we end up where we are now, where we're not delivering kids from poverty out of poverty.
I appreciate that sort of, that nuance there, that any tool that we have is simply a tool. It's a piece of a journey. It's not the end in of itself. One last question, and then we'll wrap. How does intrinsic motivation influence breaking the poverty cycle?
I mean, intrinsic motivation, So I believe intrinsic motivation is actually always connected to the reward. That's why I go to expectancy theory. Kids have to see that that journey is going to lead them somewhere. K-12 education is not delivering them out of poverty, and it has to. That's how they're going to be motivated. Got it.
So we are wrapping up here today. I would love a round of applause for Dr. Tequilla Brownie. I'm going to do one shameless plug that tomorrow we'll be giving the Rather Prize for Innovation in Texas Education. Dan Rather is a strong Texas schools advocate. That's one of our sessions. And of course, look through your program for a number of amazing sessions throughout the next several days. Thank you.